Hello and welcome, What the Finances, to another episode of the What the Finance podcast, where we talk to experts to help gain a greater understanding about what is happening in the world of finance, investing, markets, and just economics in general. So on today's podcast, I'm happy to welcome Chris Blackhurst, who's a commentator, strategic communications advisor, and writer of the recently released book, Too Big to Jail, Inside HSBC, the Mexican Drug Cartels, and the Greatest Banking Scandal of the Century. So Chris, thanks for joining the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. So if we look at the book, what was really your influence for writing it?
It was a story I knew about. I was city editor of the London Evening Standard when the story broke back in 2012. And I knew that HSBC had copped the biggest fine in American history, $1.9 billion. And it was always lodged in my mind. And it was a story, though, that never really, it didn't, I always felt, or I certainly when I looked into it, that was reinforced, that it never got the coverage it deserved. It was and is an almighty scandal. And I just started looking into it and then realized, yes, this is huge.
Yeah, and do you think maybe that was because of after 2008, there'd been so many scandals recently, maybe everyone had just had enough of it, or?
I think there was that. I think there was a bit of banker fatigue. But the point about what HSBC were doing and what they admitted to, let's not forget they admitted to all this, was that they were facilitating the laundering of billions of dollars of drugs money for the biggest drugs organization in the world, right across the United States. All the cities, lots of towns, they were all being sold drugs by the Sinaloa cartel. And without this laundering, Chapo, who was the world's #1 drug baron, would not have been able to have gone on the way he did. And in many ways, it was a more straightforward case than what happened in 2008. 2008 was more of a, how can I put it, more of an industry problem. I mean, it was endemic across the industry. This was specific to HSBC.
Yeah, definitely. And if we look at sort of maybe HSBC's history and where the bank came from, I think you talk about, it's really interesting about the culture of HSBC, and there's some fascinating stories about how that's evolved over 150 years. But how would you say it's different maybe to other international banks potentially?
HSBC is a truly international bank. It started in Hong Kong. It had its roots very much in the former British Empire. And as you say, I mean, and it's in the book that they ran themselves almost along militaristic lines. I mean, they're very proud. The founder of the bank was a Scot, and they thought they got this ideal mix of Scottish banking caution mixed with this internationalism. But they ran it on very strict military, or very disciplinarian grounds, very different from other banks. And they grew and grew from Hong Kong right across, right across the world. But they had 2002. They won the award for the best run global bank in the world. A best run global banking organization, and then they decided that that wasn't good enough. They wanted to be the biggest bank in the world, which meant that they were really taking on Bank of America and Citi, and that's when things really started to go wrong.
Yeah, well, I guess it sort of sounds quite similar to another UK bank that actually had a lot of struggles, Royal Bank of Scotland, which, is quite funny. You mentioned the Scottish banking principles. I think that company as well, talked about that and talked about the benefits it would have on the world, but unfortunately didn't succeed. But it seems like there was Fred Godwin. He was really talking about, empire building and growth. And it seemed like that was another issue that occurred at HSBC at the time as well. So do you think maybe it was more of an industry issue that, these big companies, it was almost like keep taking over or be eating yourself? Or do you think it was maybe just these individual companies that focused on that?
I think what happens, I think the pressure from investors, from Wall Street and from the City of London, from the institutions all over, is they never want an organisation to stand still. They want it to get bigger. And there's a section in the book where I talk about our obsession with big, the idea that the bigger you are, the better you are, the bigger the house, the bigger the yacht, the bigger the salary, big, big, big. And in fact, there's an interesting correlation with Royal Bank of Scotland, because not only did they decide to get very big, and they had this foundation supposedly in Scottish banking, which is meant to be really cautious. You only borrow what you can afford, etc., etc. But the other thing they did, it wasn't just they got bigger. They both invested massively in their buildings, and there's a section in the book where I talk about. I mean, what they did is that they bought. What HSBC did was they bought the fifth biggest bank in Mexico, which frankly no one really outside Mexico had ever heard of, called Bital. And on the strength of that, and as I say, the fifth biggest. So on the strength of that, they then built in no time at all in the center of Mexico City, a giant tower, which they lavished huge treatment on. And it's exactly the same as Royal Bank of Scotland. I mean, Royal Bank of Scotland built this incredible headquarters outside Edinburgh with they had their own scallops restaurant. They wanted fresh fish. They wanted this, they wanted that. They had all these fountains and waterfalls. Get real, guys, it's a bank. And that's what they did.
Yeah, and I think, the thing that I guess, reminded me of Royal Bank of Scotland as well was they wanted to be the largest bank. And, Royal Bank of Scotland was at one time, they had the most assets under management, similar to HSBC. So as you said, it's almost this, ever, they can't quench their thirst of trying to be bigger and better and trying to be the biggest.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to be the biggest. I mean, look, we all aspire to, big things, but the point about this is there's nothing wrong with it, but there is something wrong with it when you're getting bigger and getting big, you're ceasing to have control. And that's exactly what happened with HSBC. They bought this tiny bank in Mexico. They renamed it HSBC. They were warned very heavily by the Mexican authorities and even their own internal warnings that Bital did not do compliance. And Bital was based in the north of Mexico, which is the drug country, where the cartels are based. And it almost became the equivalent of Heart of Darkness, or as it was filmed, Apocalypse Now, where they had this bit of the bank that was out of control in one part of the world, and the bosses in London and in the States were they were just trying to get bigger and bigger. So no sooner did they buy Bital, they were carrying on buying other banks. Then they bought Household, the consumer lender in America, for $14 billion. And all that, all these collective eyes were off the ball. And meanwhile, Chapo and his henchmen were pushing an open door. They were laundering more and more money through HSBC in Mexico.
Yeah, and I guess why do they have that need to? I know you mentioned the book. Why do they have that need to launder money? And I guess how do they take advantage of HSBC's issues?
Yeah, it's very, very simple. Well, not simple if you're Chapo. Basically, let's start at the very rock bottom. Rock bottom is you're on the street, you're selling drugs. In return for the drugs, whatever it is, marijuana, heroin, crystal meth, whatever you're selling, you get in return cash, and you actually get dollar bills. And actually, they're pretty dirty dollar bills. They're crumpled. They've been, somebody's just handed you cash. This is not, it's not, you're not using credit cards or anything like that. It's a cash transaction. He was selling so many drugs, such quantities, that he was getting billions of dollars back in return in cash. Now, you cannot go into a bank, despite some of the movies where people turn up in banks with holdalls full of cash. You cannot go into a bank in the United States with a holdall full of cash and not invite questions. It doesn't happen. There are cameras everywhere. And he couldn't get rid of this money in the States. So he had to smuggle it back to Mexico, back down the routes that they'd used to bring the drugs in. So drugs were coming down one way and money was coming back the other. Then, of course, he had to find somewhere in Mexico to put it. Unfortunately, there was HSBC Mexico, and all sorts of things happened. And it's all in the book, but give you an idea. In one visit, I mean, let's think. You go to a bank. The guy in front of you in the queue, he deposits $933,000 in cash. Now, I'm the sort of guy who's quite impatient. I would be going crazy while all this was being counted out in front of me. He had 50 bundles of 50,000 notes plus a spare 33,000. That did not set off alarm bells in HSBC. Similarly, the Chapo realized it'd be much quicker if they had boxes or pouches made that exactly fitted the teller's windows. So the tellers didn't even have to ask questions. They just put the money in and that was it. And all that was going on. And, the alarm bells weren't going off. And then there was one big problem, which was by Mexican law, every bank accounts have to be held in pesos. Well, and I know that the peso is not the most reliable currency in the world. It's not a widely accepted currency. So Chapo, having got dollars in the States, brought them to Mexico, put them into accounts, and converted them into pesos, wanted to get them back into dollars. And lo and behold, HSBC, their marketing people said, well, you can use, and obviously they weren't talking to Chapo direct, but they were talking to all sorts of clients who should have raised alarm bells, so the sort of people they were. They said, we've got just the facility for you. It's our operation in the Cayman Islands. Well, you can hold dollar accounts. So in no time at all, 60,000, I mean, not 60, not 1,000, 60,000 accounts were opened in the Cayman Islands holding $1.2 billion. And that gives you some idea of what was going on. And this was going on for years.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned it in the book as well, just how much cash HSBC was actually moving, how much US dollars compared to sort of other competitors. They were more than other competitors, even though they were only the fourth largest bank.
That's right.
In Mexico.
And the final bit of this sort of circular, where does the money flow, the flow chart, was that the dollars that were deposited in Mexico had to be taken back to the United States and put into HSBC in the States. And they were using armored trucks and all sorts, and coming over the border with security guards and everything. But the amount of dollars that was coming back from HSBC Mexico into the States was bigger than all the other Mexican banks combined. I mean, not even one, but all of them together. So that clearly alerted the American authorities. They said, what the hell, what's going on here? And the Mexicans they had actually been to branches of HSBC Mexico and seen for themselves what was happening, and it was blatant stuff. There was hardly any attempt to disguise what was going on, and they all came together and decided they'd quite rightly go for HSBC.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned how, there were some warnings within the company, but there was just a disconnect, I guess, between HSBC Mexico, head office in London and US, or what do you?
Yeah, well, basically, people in Mexico were warning. There's one exchange where one of their guys from Mexico City goes up country, and he reports back that he cannot, but he is literally horrified by what he's seen. And there were repeated warnings, but this is where you get into the sort of territory of big corporate, really, because they kept changing their personnel in London. Their compliance people kept changing. Compliance in any bank, as you know, is not how can I put this politely? It's not the sexiest job in the world. It's not, if you're in compliance, you're not the front hitter. You're not the person who's bringing in the big checks, the big mandates. You're almost like you're the referee. I mean, you're not the most popular guy in the bank, frankly. And they weren't being listened to. They weren't being taken seriously. Meanwhile, HSBC was expanding everywhere. And of course, we did hit the 2008 crisis, and everyone's eyes were off the ball. I mean, every single person who it's possible at the senior level not to be noticing what was going on. Well, they didn't notice but they should have. The whole point is they should have done. And it's hard to imagine that the figures. I mean, they went from making virtually, I don't think they made a penny in Mexico when they first arrived. And within a few years, they were making over $1 billion a year profit from Mexico. And they kept mentioning it and citing it at their shareholder meetings, the success of Mexico. And they never really got under the bonnet or under the hood, as Americans say, to find out what was actually going on.
Yes, I guess, do you think it was just that, HSB was so big, it was, the management was too spread out and, there was too many things to focus on that they weren't able to see it? Or do you think maybe there was incompetence and just sort of looking?
I think it was a combination of things. I think it was size. I think that, I mean, look, I've spent nearly all my career writing about businesses, and as a financial journalist and commentator, we are expected to laud and praise businesses for growing. I mean, that's the way we are. We the big, as I said earlier, the bigger the business, the better. We want the profits to be bigger, the returns to be bigger. Everything's got to be bigger. And we never really stop and pause and think, what does that mean? Well, in HSBC's case, they went from 177,000 employees. That's a big number. But within 2 years, they were at 330,000. Now, 330,000 employees across, from memory, 64 different territories. And don't forget, they're handling millions of transactions every day. How can you possibly manage that? How can anybody really have an idea? I mean, right now within HSBC, and not just HSBC, but a lot of banks, the idea that they know what their people are up to and what's happening in all their different domains, it's impossible. So that was going on, and they just and then the irony of all this, of course, which is in the title, is that when push came to shove, when the Americans, the CIA, the DEA, Department of Justice, wanted to throw the book at HSBC, and they really did, there was no messing about. They wanted to bring prosecutions, they wanted convictions. This was not the same as 2008. They were persuaded by the British government that HSBC was too big. I mean, that's the ultimate irony. It was the reason it went wrong was because it was too big. The reason there weren't convictions was because it was too big. Why? Because if they brought prosecutions resulting in convictions, the British government argued, and this is all in the book in emails and phone traffic, that they risked not only bringing down the biggest bank in Europe, and HSBC had by then become the biggest bank in the world, they risked bringing that bank down, but they risked bringing down the entire Western financial system. And that was an argument that I remember I covered 2008 every day for newspaper in London. And I remember that argument being made then, that it was, in that case, it was too big to fail. Now, years later with HSBC, it was too big to jail.
Yeah, and I guess you could say at the time there was sort of the Europe crisis as well. So maybe they're concerned that that could just exacerbate the problem. But yeah, as you said, it's hard to see how that's a rightful punishment. I think you mentioned, it was a $2 billion fine, sorry, but that was, what was it, 1/10 of their profit a few years previous. So
yeah, it was actually amounted to 5 weeks' profits.
Yeah.
So, we all think $1.9 billion, wow, that is a huge amount of money. But then somebody says to you, yeah, but it's only 5 weeks' profits. And within the bank, it's written down as a cost of doing business. No one suffered because of it. And it's not much of a punishment. I mean, it's the equivalent in sport when you have some of the world's highest paid athletes, whether they're soccer players, footballers, basketball players, whenever they're fined for something, they're fined a week's wages or something like that, then we all shrug and laugh because frankly it doesn't make any difference to them at all. And this is the banking equivalent. I mean, $1.9 billion, yeah, but it's 5 weeks profit. Discuss.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you mentioned as well that they were fined by the Mexican government, which was like the largest fine they could give, and it was only $30 million, and they didn't even mention it in any of their.
Yeah, I felt sorry for them. I mean, throughout this book, actually, I began as I was doing the research and talking to the Mexicans, that I feel sorry for them, for the people who are in charge of bank supervision and trying to keep their economy on track, because they take huge personal risk. I mean, we have no idea about the embedded nature of the drugs trade in Mexico and the violence and the casual violence that the people use. I mean, it's entirely different from the UK, US, Europe. I mean, this is violence on a unfathomable level. I mean, and barbaric, and they do it in a very, casual way. And so these people are taking huge personal risk. And the idea we have is that somehow Mexico and the authorities are all lax. They don't care. They don't really. It's a corrupt country. Actually, I found that the people in charge of the bank on the banking side were very honest, tough, very clear-sighted people of what they wanted. And the insult, as it were, was that they fined HSBC. It was $28 million, which actually was the largest amount they were able to fine. But HSBC, they then said to HSBC, it's not in your accounts. And HSBC replied saying, it's too small. I mean, it's so incidental. It doesn't even register. There wasn't even a footnote in their accounts. It's an accounting error. Wasn't anything. And that gives you, again, some idea of how these banks behave. And where they are, and not just banks, by the way. I mean, we live in an age where, as I say, big is best, and several of the tech corporations are now bigger than countries. Big pharma, big oil, retailers, banks, they're bigger than actual countries, and yet we don't have a means of bringing them under control. The only thing that their executives will understand is jail. There's no point in finding them. What's that going to achieve?
Yeah, I guess for them it's a challenge because they're going to say, oh, we had no idea about it, but then they're responsible for what happens in their company. It's that challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, somebody has to be responsible. And in HSBC's case, and this is one of the, from a journalistic writing standpoint, one of the beauties of the story is that, although it makes you angry at the same time, is that they admitted, their admission actually runs to 30 odd pages, 31 pages, I think, of what they were doing for Chapo. And the other point I'd make as well is that you and I, if I, God forbid, if I step outside my house now and I deal drugs, I don't, by the way, but if I did, or you did, and you did it 3 times, or I did it 3 times, particularly 3 times in America, you can go to jail for life. That's it, life. You're not going to, there's no argument. You're going to jail, and you're going there for a long time. Well, that's true in the UK as well, and it's true in lots of countries. And not just drugs, all sorts of offences. You're going to jail. That's it. But if you're a major company, a major corporation, you can enter into what's called a deferred prosecution agreement, where you strike a bargain with the authorities that they will fine you. You pay a fine, you enter some sort of reform rehab program, and that's it. You're okay. And well, that option isn't available to you or I. To ordinary citizens, we can't negotiate. I can't say to the cops, guys, look, can I buy my way out of this? No, you can't. You're going to jail. Well, that doesn't happen for major corporations. And this is a big issue, really, as to, what are we trying to achieve here?
Yeah, I think it was really interesting at the start. You said that's what a lot of the law enforcement used to do. They used to go after the people at the bottom, but then someone told them to chase the money. And that's really where I guess this came from, and how they were able to track down Chapo. So I guess that's maybe a move that they're going towards, trying to get the linchpins.
Yeah, that's another thing, that our approach, particularly in the war on drugs, we treat it as a war. So we like to parade our seizures, we like to parade the weapons we've caught, the amount of drugs, and so every so often, and it happens in all countries like this, that they call a press conference, and there's all the drugs, all the machine guns, the hand grenades, and then there's 2 or 3 ringleaders they're shown and they're going to jail. But hey, you know what happens? The drugs don't stop. The flow of drugs continues, the gangs continue, the Sinaloa cartel continues. I mean, Chapo is in prison. Chapo got life plus 30 years in a court in New York. He's in jail. The Sinaloa cartel continues. And it's not, we should really, by all means, go after the people at the bottom, but we should really be following the money and going after the people at the top. Where does the money go? You cut off that money supply, then they are stuck. If we cut off the money for Chapo, he would not have been able to buy more weapons. He would not have been able to buy more drugs. He wouldn't have been able to buy his cars, his mansions, because they're all paid for the normal way.
Yeah, I think we're seeing that there's more of an understanding of that. I guess you could say with, Russia, Ukraine, there's lots of Russian sanctions trying to prevent them from using money. You could say Iran, all these countries. I guess we are moving to that point where potentially you can cut off people's money supply so they can't survive doing bad things.
We've sort of realized it a bit with sanctions and Ukraine and Russia. But I think in other areas of crime, other areas where there's crime, particularly white collar crime, we don't do it as well and don't take it as seriously, and we should. I mean, we have to ask ourselves. I mean, in the book, there's a big section on the Cayman Islands and how they were using the Cayman Islands. Well, you have to ask yourself, what is the Cayman Islands for? Of course, it's a pretty place and nice place to go on holiday and all that. But that doesn't explain why there are buildings and towers and office blocks with hundreds, thousands of businesses registered there. And that's true of lots of places in the Caribbean. It's true of Delaware. It's true of the Channel Islands, near the UK, the Isle of Man, Panama, Gibraltar. All these places are being used to launder money.
Yes, I think, as you said, it's getting to the point where, there are consequences for this. It's not just a slap on the wrist or, a small fine. It's actually jail time or more.
Yeah, I mean, we can carry on like this make no mistake, right now, people around the world are laundering money and they're doing it through mainstream banks. And we can carry on like this until we start jailing people within the banks, within financial services. They will not take it seriously. They will not take it as serious. It's funny, isn't it? They'll take, on a personal level, they would take, driving under the influence. They would take that really seriously. They would not want to be stopped by the cops and, hauled over for driving under the influence. So they take that seriously, and they don't drink at parties. And if they're getting in the car, they won't drink. They know they're not to drink alcohol. But when it comes to this, there's a totally different mindset. And it's somehow we have to bring them both together.
Yeah, definitely. And hopefully, I guess, I think we are going in the right direction. I guess it's the challenge of, I know in the UK, they try to change some laws for auditors to try and make them accountable, and they didn't like that. So I guess it's the challenge of actually making the changes for all this to happen.
I think so, but I think the other problem is that what happens is that the industry, whether it's accountancy, banking, whatever the industry is, they always have more money than the government. Their people are paid more than government officials. They recruit the brightest and the best. They get the best law firms in New York, Washington, London, wherever it is, and they go to work, and they will water down whatever it is that's being proposed. And actually, we should stop all this and keep it really simple, and just jail people. That would stop. That would make them wake up. But what happens with these deferred prosecution agreements is that, and it happened with HSBC. This is exactly what happened. They said to HSBC, "We're going to fine you. Okay, great, relief all round. We're not going to jail. No one's going to jail. Few, but then they got into a negotiation with the bank as to the size of the fine and the length of the rehab program that was to follow. Well, the problem there is that there's a world of difference between telling somebody what's going to happen and having a negotiation. And nobody is better at negotiating than a bank or these big businesses. That's what they do. They negotiate takeovers. So the second it's switched, it turns and becomes a negotiation. The the power of the judiciary, the authorities, has gone. It's lost, because you're now dealing with some of the world's best negotiators, and they will make very sure that what is finally agreed is the very best they could get for their bank. Whether it's the best for society at large is a different question.
Yeah, and as you mentioned there in the US, the DOJ, they decided to settle it because I guess the issue is they only have a finite amount of resources. They can't continue something like this for 4, 5, 6 years, which what it could be in the normal legal system. So I guess for them, if they can settle with a big fine for them, then that's at least they've gotten something out of it, I guess.
I'm not stupid. I can see the counter argument that says, yes, Chris, but if you're going to start trying to bring criminal prosecutions, you're going to be tied up in the courts for years. I get that, of course, but there has to be a point where somehow we have to make an example. No one was jailed in 2008, and that fact rankles to this day. I mean, it is mentioned repeatedly by politicians in Washington, in London, and in other places. Society feels very sore that no senior banker was prosecuted over 2008, and society ended up paying the bill, footing the bill. Here we are, where a bank is found to have been enabling the laundering of billions of dollars. No one is prosecuted. And at some point, I suppose what you have to ask yourself then is, how bad does it have to get before we actually prosecute a banker for anything? I mean, I suppose if a banker attacked a client or a colleague and killed them in the bank, there might be a prosecution. But even then, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I agree. Things definitely have to change. So, Chris, thank you so much for your time today to talk about your book. I guess what is one message you'd like people maybe to take away from our interview or the book in general?
I think. Look, I've written it as a very colourful. Hope it's colourful, pacey account. It's not deliberately not complicated. It's a very simple story. I think people, when they read it, will be shocked and surprised. But I think we have to ask ourselves, is this enough? Have we reached the point where enough is enough? And we have to start jailing people and take it more seriously, because we do not take white collar crime seriously enough. We really don't. If you've got money and you're powerful, you're probably not going to go to jail. And that is wrong.
I agree. And I think it's a very important point. So, Chris, thanks again. As we mentioned, your book is available on all platforms. I guess if anyone else wanted to maybe keep up to date with your work or what you do, would there be anywhere else they could find you?
I write columns for the Independent newspaper in London on their website now. National in UAE. I write a lot. They'll find me. I'm out there.
Google your name then.
Okay.
That's the way to do it. But yeah, Chris, thanks again for your time.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for listening. And if you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe and click the bell icon so you are notified when new podcasts are released. I hope you're leaving with some great value about investing, trading, and finance. See you on the next show.